Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. I'm your host, Chris Hill. The edit. If you thought recording was fun, you're going to love the edit. Well, I hope you're going to love the edit. It will take you 3 to 4 times as long as the recording to clean it and get it sounding good, so you better enjoy it or find someone who does. Like my fantastic team of editors at HumblePod.
Stay humble.
So, what goes into an edit? We'll pick up where we left off in the last episode, with your recording. As I said last time, you're only going to sound as good as the audio you record. So the first thing we need to do is check our recording from the last episode. One thing that I've learned in all my years of podcasting is that it's very easy to overlook things in a recording session. For instance, you might be recording in your home. You're probably used to every noise around you. As a result, you probably don't realize that your HVAC going is obnoxiously loud until you listen to the recording in post. Even if it wasn't obnoxiously loud when you recorded, the recorded audio will probably be amplifying sounds you only subconsciously paid attention to prior to having a podcast. Now those sounds are glaringly obvious, and you have no clue how to fix them. On top of that, for some reason your mic volume is way quieter than it needs to be, and your guest wouldn't stay on the microphone, so you've got to wrangle some crazy volume fluctuations or risk blowing out your listeners' ears. Then there's the one part where an ambulance came flying by when you were recording, and now you have to edit that too. It can get overwhelming really quickly. First of all, I want to reassure you that if this is your first recording, these things happen. You will learn what to look out for in time as you learn your equipment and finally get bold enough to ask your guests to stay on mic during a session. What's important right now, though, is that we focus on how we can work through these issues. At this point, you might be a bit frustrated. What you thought yesterday was a great session turned out to be... If you really think the audio was that bad, please go back and re-record. There is nothing worse in my mind than saying we can fix it in post. It is the great lie of content creation that Adobe Creative Suite is capable of fixing every creative failure. Fixing it in pre is always the better decision. And yes, you'll learn how to anticipate those things as you get more experience in podcasting. As you'll see, there are some absolutely magical tools at your disposal for editing, but they can be overused or, worse, may not solve your problem the way you hoped it would. Which is why I say, you're only going to sound as good as the audio you record. So go back and listen again. Make the decision on what to do, and when you're ready, I'll be here waiting for you. Okay. Now that we've decided to move forward with the audio we've reviewed, it's time to take a look at my recommended podcast editing workflow. The editing workflow consists of 4 stages. 1, assemble. 2, edit. 3, review. And 4, master. The first step of this process is to assemble the podcast, and the very first part of assembly is reviewing the audio. And since we've already reviewed the audio, we've got a great jump start. Next, we actually need to import your audio. So we need to manage the actual assembly of your first episode. I'm going to assume you know how to move audio from your recording device to your computer. And if you don't, because it's always bad to assume, I'll include a link to Zoom and Rode's product support pages in the show notes. If you used a USB interface to record, then there's a good chance you've already got this in a DAW or on an online recording source somewhere. Now for the next step, and the most exciting, opening up your DAW, or digital audio workstation. Now that we've got all this ready to go, it's time to get editing. But what DAW do you choose and why? As I stated earlier, I recommend Adobe Audition, but you could just as easily use Pro Tools, Logic Pro, or even Descript, Audacity, or GarageBand. It all depends on how much you want to learn and your budget to edit and learn these tools. For beginners, I recommend Descript or Audacity. Audacity is a traditional DAW that is open source or free. It doesn't have the better user interface, but it does the job well and is surprisingly capable for editing your podcast. Descript, on the other hand, is very non-traditional. You pay a monthly fee, and you edit your content based on auto-transcription. Descript is a fantastic tool that we use at HumblePod for heavy content editing and narrative production. It also interfaces with DAWs, so you can use some of its awesome tools like remove filler words as part of your workflow. It is capable of editing a podcast from beginning to end and includes a lot of automations for making mixing and mastering easy. If you're coming from the content marketing world and don't have time to fiddle with the more advanced tools like Audition or Pro Tools, it's definitely a good starting place. That said, personally, I recommend Adobe Audition. I have found it to have the overall best set of built-in tools and cleanup capabilities. The fact that you can review and directly edit audio on the spectral frequency is pretty awesome. The only other way to do that is to invest in something like iZotope's RX platform, which frankly is amazing in its own right, but that can easily set you back another $500 to $1,000 depending on which version of the software you get. If you plan on editing your own audio, with Audition, you'll be set for at least a year with the plugins that are available just baked into the software. As for Pro Tools, be my guest if you want to use it. It's definitely a fantastic editing tool, but my perception is that this tool's really meant for music production. On top of that, it's not as flexible as programs like Adobe Audition, where you can, say, reprogram hotkeys. There is definitely clearly a Pro Tools way, and your option is to follow what they say or find a different DAW. You can even buy keyboards that highlight all the shortcuts. That's how much of a standard it is. If you're just starting out, I definitely don't recommend starting here. If you want to make audio production a career, though, it might be worth looking into. Now, once you've decided on your DAW, it's time to get down to business and start on the edit. At this point, I need to be clear that I'm only providing a general workflow and tips along the way. If you really want to learn to edit, the Podcast Engineering School is a fantastic resource if you're serious about this as a profession. And Mike Russell does some fantastic YouTube videos on how to edit in Adobe Audition if you want to do it all yourself. After all, this is a podcast, not a YouTube video. So there's only so much we can discuss without having to visually see what to do. One of the first things we need to discuss before we dive into the edit is how to edit your audio. In general, there are two approaches to editing: destructive and non-destructive editing. Non-destructive editing is a process that leaves the original audio file in its original form. You can cut up the track and make changes that you need to, and it won't affect anything in the original content. The vast majority of editing you do will be non-destructive, and most DAWs default to non-destructive editing when you jump into a multi-track session to use them. Destructive editing, on the other hand, is a process that affects the original audio file. In general, you use destructive editing when you can't mitigate the problem through track plugins or non-destructive edits, or just the plugin itself would take too long to run on the export and you want to take care of something now. A destructive edit can be as simple as erasing a part of the track where there's an annoying noise, or as complex as restoring audio frequencies that dropped out because your guest is using AirPod Pros over a Zoom interview. Destructive edits can be powerful, and by that token, they can be damaging to the final product as well. So use destructive edits with caution, and always ensure you have a backup of the original file you intend to work with. Okay, that said, it's time to get all these tracks level and add any effects processing you think you'll need. We do this first. That way you can adjust as you go if something isn't quite where you thought it should be. Also remember, this is going to take time to do. Your ears are going to get tired. Yes, really, I'm not kidding. They will get tired. And so you want to manage this piece while you're fresh. Over the course of this edit, it will also allow you to discover if processing is too much or not enough for your mix. As for what processing to add to your tracks, I recommend the following effects to get started: an equalizer, a compressor, and a noise gate or expander. An equalizer is a plugin that will help you adjust volumes at different frequency bands with an audio signal. It has many different applications, but the most important thing to know is that this will help you balance your voice and your guest's voice, and can also be used to edit out annoying frequencies on a track. For instance, remember that HVAC rumble? A high-pass filter can reduce that rumble to almost nothing. Just be sure not to set it too high, or you'll start to cut into the quality of your own voice. On the other end of the audio spectrum, EQ can be used to reduce sibilance. This is especially helpful if your mic is what I would consider to be bright or weighted towards higher frequencies. Now, you can use a de-esser plugin to reduce sibilance, and that is actually the recommended method for dealing with sibilance, but if you're looking to keep it simple, a good multi-band equalizer will do the job just as well. In general with EQ, my goal is clarity. Most people think of radio voices when they edit audio and recall the boomy bass they hear on the track. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen this cause editors to weight the track towards a boomy bass, and ultimately leading to the track sounding muddled the minute you're not listening on a proper pair of headphones. This is because I think a lot of people tend to neglect the high end when they edit. My recommendation here is to think of what needs to be done to hear your audio with noise in the background. Remember that most people will be hearing you while in the car or doing something other than sitting down listening on a pair of studio monitors. Next, we have the compressor. The reason we use compression in audio is so that we can limit or compress the dynamic range of the track and help balance the volume a little bit. A basic rule of thumb is to ensure that you don't over-compress the track though. If you do, your audio will end up sounding literally compressed, like this sounds right now. It's also worth noting that a compressor is not the be-all, end-all solution for balancing your track's volume, but it helps focus the track's range enough to be a solid assist in this process. Lastly, we have the noise gate and/or expander. A noise gate is a plugin that will cut off the noise below a specified volume threshold. An expander is basically the same thing, even sometimes to the point where it's just a button on the noise gate plugin. Only, it functions a lot more like a compressor. It compresses volumes below a specified volume level. In general, this kind of volume reduction is smoother, and in my experience, much better for spoken word audio like podcasting. Gates and expanders can be very difficult to dial in perfectly though. Therefore, this plugin is optional. Especially in the beginning, I recommend very limited use of this effect. They can really ruin a track if you don't get it set properly. And you don't want audio that is choppy. If it sounds like that, you've gone too far with your settings. Also, again, I highly recommend using a noise gate with the option for an expander or just a straight up expander. As I've already noted, the expander is a smoother type of gate, and it will ensure tracks don't have annoying pops when you start talking. Once you've got your plugins set up for all your tracks, it's time to do an initial balance on the volume. For this, I recommend using a plugin called Lean Loudness Meter. And if you just said, what the heck is that? I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Visually, on Ulean's plugin, what you're looking for is to keep the volume balanced between tracks. When the speaker changes, when there's transition audio, you don't want the volumes to have any dramatic drops or increases. This tool allows you to see a history of the audio and will help ensure that you're getting a good track through and through. And also ensure you're not blowing out your listeners' eardrums at the same time. There's nothing worse than listening to something really quiet and turning it up, only to have someone else chime in at 10 times the volume. We all know what that's like, and it's annoying. It's so annoying that I'm not even going to do a sound effect for that one. I value your hearing. You're welcome. Now that we've got the plugin set up and the volume balanced, it's time to settle in and start editing. But what do we edit? And how do we know what to clean up? I recommend a 2-pass edit when you edit your podcast. And what I mean by that is you're going to go through this audio twice. In the first pass, we'll edit the obvious. You probably know what content needs to be taken out of your recording session, so we'll start there. Take out what you know needs to be taken out content-wise, and tighten up the session overall. Are there gaps between speakers? Is there a big gap at the beginning or the end? Is there stuff that you just left recording, hoping it would become something and it doesn't need to be there? Take all that out. Clean all that up. Make sure your tracks are in sync and aligned, and put them together. Also make sure that you group your tracks. That way when you move things around, stuff doesn't get out of place and tracks don't get out of sync. On the second pass, it's time to clean up the small stuff and those little disfluencies. What is a disfluency? Well, it's another way of saying filler words. Disfluencies are any words that are used to fill dead air. Prime offenders include ums, ahs, as well as likes and you knows, and any other phrases that people repeat to the point it's obnoxious. Something important here to note though, you don't want to cut all of them out. First of all, some disfluencies can be hard to cut if they run up against another word. Secondly, removing all disfluencies can leave you sounding almost robotic. Plus, disfluencies have been proven to aid in memory retention, so feel free to have an allowance for them. The ones I would target are the obvious filler words, the ones you can literally pick out on the track with your naked eye, and things that add no value to the conversation. You want to make your guests and hosts look and sound as good as possible, right? So edit with that in mind. Once we have your edits complete, it's time for the review. Take a listen to the whole track. If you're several hours in, I recommend you do this the next day. Listen fresh, make sure there aren't any noises you want to take out, and adjust the EQ and other effects as necessary. If you're working with a team, you might also want to consider passing it around for review as well. Once this piece is done, it's time to master your audio. The first thing we'll do with the master is, surprise, surprise, double check and make sure your volume is actually balanced across all tracks. Make sure this is true of the music and any transitional effects as well. Once you've got that done, you're going to mix this all down into a single file. It's at this point that we need to finalize the episode's volume and make any last-minute tweaks. So how do we know how loud a podcast should be? Well, podcasts abide by the LUFS, that's LUFS standard. LUFS stands for Loudness Units Relative to Full Scale. And really all this means is this measurement factors in the human perception of loudness and the electrical signal intensity of the volume. LUFS are actually the standard for most movies, TV, radio, and music. And to be frank, this is another thing I love about Adobe Audition is that they have this nifty amplitude statistics window which will give you a readout of the entire track in one click. It's another great baked-in plugin that I highly recommend utilizing if you're going with Audition. Ulean will also do a track readout. Just drag and drop the file into the plugin and it'll analyze it and give you the final LUFS output that you want. Now that we know what LUFS are, podcasts need to be mastered to -16 LUFS for stereo and -19 LUFS for mono. And neither stereo or mono should cross the -1 dB peak loudness. Audition has a loudness meter, which will help you determine the overall volume for your track if you choose to edit the audio manually. The quick and easy way to master is to use a program like iZotope's Ozone. This program will let you set the volume level and peak loudness that you want to hit, and the software will automate the rest of the process for you. The manual way to do this involves getting your LUFS set pre-MP3 export or even pre-export from the multi-track edit and working with the volume and the EQ to find that perfect balance that gets you to that LUFS number you want to hit. As you can imagine, that can be really tedious. When you've completed this step, you're essentially done mastering. Now all we need to do is save the file and convert it to an MP3. Now, there's a lot of argument here, but personally I recommend exporting your audio at 192 kilobits per second. And yes, I know the standard rate is 128 kilobits per second, but podcast hosts will accept higher fidelity audio. And this helps you get a little bit better audio fidelity for listeners as well. It's also at this stage that you should add your show's metadata. You can add the episode title and even graphics in this part. If you insert markers in Audition, those will transfer over to some podcast directories as markers too. So watch what you put in the MP3 if your audio goes to one such host. For example, I'm currently using Omni for this podcast, and it inserts markers that I align with the sections of my podcast. This makes it easy to track within the content that I'm creating and highlight specific content as well. Now, once you've got that saved, we're ready for the last step in getting your podcast live, the launch. But before we do that, you need to finish your edit, which of course brings us to your homework. For your homework, I want you to edit your show. Obviously, use the resources provided in this show and have a go at the first cut. If this is your first time editing, I want you to share the edit with someone you know and trust to give you good feedback. Chances are you'll do something that you shouldn't have done, and that feedback will be invaluable in finding that out. If at this point you're realizing that editing isn't going to be your thing, that's fine too. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is my company's area of expertise. If you'd like for us to help you out, you're welcome to reach out to me at chris@humblepod.com or fill out the Contact Us form on HumblePod's website. So, let's get to slicing up your recording, because in the next episode, we're going to be launching your podcast. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting. This has been a HumblePod production.
stay humble.